A motorcar was heading down a road in the countryside. Inside were 3 people. A man called Alexander Stanton, his wife Elma and their son Thomas. They were heading to their newly built country house for the summer. Alexander just recently came back to Blighty after serving his time during the Great War, which ended in tragedy as he lost his left arm during the Second Battle of Ypres and had to get it amputated. The country house called CHASTLEMAIN'S was originally meant to be built 6 years before but got stalled due to lack resources and managed to get done just before the Great War broke out 2 years earlier. When they arrive, they are greeted by the staff and are welcomed inside. Alexander gleamed at the structure of CHASTLEMAIN and was relieved that it was built before he was recruited to serve his country. Elma kinda liked it and felt it was a place for safety, away from the echoes of conflict and panic. It was also a stepping stone of rehabilitation for her husband, who lost one of his limbs during battle. When she got the news that he was badly injured, her thoughts went wild and believed that he didn't make it. Raising her only child on her own and carrying the mournful baggage throughout her life, but thankfully he pulled through. She had to accept that he was permanently disabled, but it didn't stop them living the happy family life, and this place was a bubble for acceptance. Thomas just looked around and felt a little disappointed. He wanted to be back in the city, but with the Great War furiously looming across parts of England, he had to accept that he had to be evacuated and wonders what will happen to his school friends, where they will be and how they will manage away from their concrete paradise. Just beside the country road leading to CHASTLEMAIN was a cow field. The cows were grazing normally and then they started to flip out. A strange sound was erupting out of nowhere and then they scattered over to patches. The TARDIS materialized and the doctor poked his head out. He called to Louisa that they are in some English countryside. She replied to him where they landed and he said that it's a cow field. The doctor stepped on the grass and Louisa followed out. She looked around feeling underwhelmed and he asked her why. She said it's an empty field and it's covered in cowpats. He said to her that its agricultural nature and using livestock to its potential helps the human race live on, for better or worse. Suddenly a couple of cows bolted and darted towards the two. The doctor said to Louisa to run. The two nearly slipped and slid because of the cowpats and managed to frantically climb the brick wall. Louisa sat on the side of the road batting her white boot to get some of the cowpat off while the doctor looked around at the open countryside and then put his finger in his mouth. Then the slight breeze gave a cold chill and then he turned to Louisa, who was a bit annoyed. Before he can utter a word, a motorcar drove up and stopped beside them. A man who was driving it was called Marston and kindly offered them a lift. The doctor accepted this and asked where Marston was heading to. He said he was heading to a country house called CHASTLEMAIN and is one of the servants there. Marston said he was running late and that he'll drop them at the place due to him running late. The two got in and Marston drove off carrying them. When they arrived, the doctor looked at CHASTLEMAIN feeling suspicious and then Marston bid them farewell as he quickly headed inside through one of the back doors. Louisa walked to the gateway and then turned the doctor, who was still looking at CHASTLEMAIN. She said to him that she was hoping for a nice walk through the countryside, but the doctor's attention was to the country house and started to walk towards it. Louisa chased after him and tried to discourage him. He said to her that something isn't right. He has a feeling something's lurking in his area and wishes to investigate. Louisa rolled her eyes at this. She was hoping for a peaceful walk around the barren but greenest parts that Britain has to offer, but had to follow the doctor in his motives like he was a psychic or someone who feels a presence from the hairs that were standing on his neck. He knocked on the door and a middle-aged doorman opened it. The doorman asked why he is here and the doctor said that he's a psychiatrist for one of his patients. In his head the doctor thought it wouldn't work, but by chance the doorman welcomed them in and the doctor's slight reaction was "oh, alright," and walked with Louisa behind as his assistant. The doorman called for Alexander. He came to entrance and welcomed him in. He did ask for his name and the doctor said his name was John Smith. Alexander also questioned about Louisa as she walked in through the door and the doctor said that she's his assistant. She tugged his cream linen jacket and he whispered to her to play along to keep it subtle. Alexander said that they should join him and his family for dinner. They were preparing kidney soup, roast mutton in onion sauce with stewed carrots, white beans and boiled potatoes. Afterwards for pudding, it's rice pudding and cheese and crackers. Also coffee for afterwards. The doctor was pleased by this and Alexander proceeded to show them around CHASTLEMAIN. As nightfall and dinner was being prepared, the doctor sat down with Louisa next to him and whispered to him about Alexander. She mentioned that his left arm was amputated. The doctor nudged her right shoulder and politely told her to keep it to herself. Elmer and Thomas entered the dining room. The servants brought out the soup. Marston walked in with serving and the doctor winked at him. Marston was confused by this but kept his thoughts to himself and walked off back down to the kitchen area. After everyone finished the soup, the main course gave in and was placed onto the table. While enjoying the food, Alexander asked the doctor about the food and he mentioned that it comes from the menu of the twin-screw steamer known as Baltic. Alexander said that he and Elmer traveled on the Baltic of the White Star Line in August 1910. He was influenced by the menu and wanted to bring back some of it to home ground when Castlemaine was in its development stages. He also mentioned that Elmer was pregnant with their son Thomas at the time. Louisa then turned her eyes to Thomas, who nearby at the table next to Elmer. Thomas was fiddling with the food with his fork. Elmer told him off as part of rude behavior at the table. Thomas just looked at her and abruptly left the table. Elmer scoldfully told him to come back but didn't listen. The doctor kindly said he's unhappy of the circumstances of what was happening. Louisa asked about these circumstances and he said to her that they are in the midst of the World War. Louisa coughed a little and said quietly if it was the Second World War. The doctor returned the response saying it's the First World War and the year they arrived in is 1916. Louisa just looked at him pensively. That night Thomas was in his bedroom when he began to hear strange scratching sounds coming from the walls. At first he was a little scared but plucked some courage to investigate what it was and then he approached his large wooden wardrobe. His first thought he thought it was rodents scavenging in the woodwork and then carefully opened it. Nothing there until a shriek abruptly caught him off guard and a large bat creature was hiding at the back of the wardrobe. Thomas scampered back to his bed and watched as the bat creature brought itself out of the wardrobe. He brought himself under the covers and hid from it. The bat creature strolled forward towards the bed and leaned in. Thomas was scared and brought himself to some courage to go face it. He brought himself out and looked out at the bat creature. It didn't go and attack him like an rabid animal, it just stared at him. Thomas looked curious at it and slowly reached his hand out to it. The bat creature touched his small palm and gave a little squeal in response. Thomas gave a little smile in relief and asked how did it get here. Suddenly the bat creature let out an ear-piercing scream and wrapped its wings around him. Thomas let out a shriek in terror. The doctor awoke from his slumber. He was sleeping on the floor and got up quickly. Louisa, who was sleeping in the bed, got up slowly and in her blurry vision saw the doctor exit the bedroom. Alexander and Elmer also awoke and headed to Thomas' bedroom. The doctor slowly followed them in and looked around searching for Thomas. The windows was opened with the curtains flapping from the breeze. Elmer was distraught by this, thinking her son was taken by kidnappers, and Alexander drastically thought some Bulgarians or Germans have taken him for ransom. The doctor's eyes took an interest to a small pile of pellets on the carpet and knelt down to inspect it. Louisa popped her head into the bedroom in her nightgown and approached the doctor in mid-investigation. He was rubbing one of these pellets between his fingers and said it's guano. Louisa said guano comes from bats, and then the doctor flinched his hand. The guano started to burn into his skin like something acidic was inside it, and he stood up rapidly shaking it to ease the burning sensation off. Alexander scoffed at the notion that a colony of bats have flown off with his son, but the doctor believes this bat colony are more advanced and maybe more monstrous than the dinky flapping creatures everyone knows. Alexander still didn't take this on board and started to think the doctor was a con man who entered his country house. He then started to say stuff that like he was a spy of a hidden organization and that Louisa was a brass nail gold digger. The doctor in a quick reaction punched Alexander in face, knocking him out. His mind then raced. He never hit a disabled man before and his clenched fist started to shake tensely. Elmer comforted her husband, who was conscious but some blood dripping from his nose, and the doctor said if they have a drawing room in this place. Elmer said yes and the doctor said they'll reconvene there. In the drawing room, Louisa watched on as the doctor dragged a wooden table to the door and blocked themselves inside. Alexander demanded what the doctor was doing and the doctor clicked his finger, then pointed at him to be silent. He wanted to know about this country house and what his intention was to build it. Alexander said that the property before the construction of Castlemaine was an old graveyard that fell into disarray and he took the opportunity to buy it. He continued on that it took 6 years to get it constructed. When the building began, workers sensed a strange feeling about the place and a couple days later a few of them disappeared. Vanished into thin air, preventing progress to become stagnant, and he wondered if building on sacred ground has its consequences. The doctor shook his head in dismay and said that constructing anything on burial grounds can lead to instances of a poltergeist presences. Elmer chimed in about what do bats have to do with burial grounds, and the doctor just fell silent. He felt a bit stumped. He then proposed the idea that they should search the grounds if anything of this graveyard remains, and Alexander reluctantly agreed to this only to get his son back. He told Elmer to stay in the house and asked Louisa to keep her company. The doctor told him that Louisa will join us and that they'll need a third pair of hands. Alexander begrudgingly agreed to this. The doctor, Louisa and Alexander headed to the grounds. They searched all over until the doctor saw a stone mausoleum amongst the shrubbery and carefully approached it. He then started to hear squealing sounds inside and told Louisa and Alexander to come over. Alexander suspects Thomas was down there and started to remove some of the shrubbery. The doctor saw the door and carefully opened it. A stench of decayed corpses quickly emerged and Louisa began to gag. The three entered in and carefully treaded into the unknown. The mausoleum was filled with skeletons and the doctor noticed that some of these were freshly dead. Alexander was starting to get into a mortified state thinking Thomas was among the lot, but the doctor reassured him that these are the size of an adult and Alexander felt a slight relief. They walked through a dugout tunnel and then approached a stone altar. There was Thomas lying in a fetal position and Alexander raced over to comfort. He looked over him. He was asleep and Alexander tried to wake him up. The doctor and Louisa around, then she noticed some red eyes peering in the darkness. The doctor told her to stay still and told Alexander to do the same. But Alexander didn't take notice and kept trying to wake Thomas up. The large bat creatures then emerged from the darkness and surrounded Alexander. They shrieked at him and started to present their claws to him. He shouted at them to keep back and away from his son. The doctor carefully strolled forward and realized what these bat creatures are. Secretive nature gods in the same vein as Kenneth Graham's version of the god Pan. Protectors of the deceased, and that they can psychically sense death, which can link to the ones of who were still living. The doctor then said that Thomas' school friends are probably dead and that's why the bat creatures have taken him. A self-rehabilitation of coping with death, and that the young boy is in the process of being mentally de-traumatized without him knowing it. Alexander looked again at his son. He felt a sense of remorse about what was going on and carefully placed him back down by the altar. He returned to the doctor and Louisa. He watched as the process continued. Then the bat creatures raised their heads up and let out a softer shriek. Thomas then awoke and stood up in front of them. The bat creatures carefully took him to his father. Alexander was relieved by this until Thomas quickly passed out. The doctor picked up the boy in his arms and said he'll be okay. He then looked at the bat creatures and nodded his head at them. Louisa stepped back a few steps and then knocked over one of the pillars. The altar room was starting to collapse and the doctor told them to leave. As they were about to leave, the doctor turned to the bat creatures. They slowly raised their clawed palms at them and the doctor returned to the surface. Back at Castlemaine, the doctor checked Thomas' temperature. He said to Alexander and Elmer that he's going to be okay. Plenty of rest and fluids. In a few days he'll back to normal. Elmer didn't say anything and Alexander thanked him for saving his son. He also apologized for saying those remarks about him and Louisa. Later on, the two bided farewell to the Stantons and walked off the grounds of Castlemaine. Louisa questioned him about the whole psychic rehabilitation and the doctor's attention then turned to a planet that hosts a ceremony involving psychically thrusting deepest fears of the mind away for good. She thought it sounded stupid, but the doctor said it's worth checking out and that it will blow her mind, he jokingly says. They entered the cow field where the TARDIS is parked. As the doctor was opening the door, a bullet ricocheted off the TARDIS exterior and suddenly turned to see a farmer holding a rifle. He shouted the two for trespassing in his field and dumping rubbish among his cows. The doctor pushed Louisa inside and got himself in quickly. The farmer let off a second shot at the exterior and then the TARDIS took off out of the crossfire.